So today we're going to talk about a different topic in IoT, namely security. There are enormous challenges in all types of wired and wireless networks when it comes to security, but especially for these applications where we have some unique characteristics for these networks and the purposes they serve make them kind of attractive targets to attacks, intrusions, spying, sniffing, and so on. So for IoT, there is no, let's say, limit to what applications you might encounter. You might encounter something from battlefield surveillance to asset tracking to monitoring infrastructure, such as, I don't know, bridges, maybe tunnels. You can assess disaster zones, or you can guide emergency response activities. So any breach of security, any compromise of information, or maybe even the disruption of the correct application of a certain behavior can have very serious consequences. So given the fact that sensor networks and IoT applications are frequently used in remote areas, which are often left unattended in operation, they are an easy target for physical attacks. So you can have unauthorized access to them, you can have tampering, and also this doesn't help that sensor nodes are typically very resource constrained devices. They operate in very harsh environments, and this further facilitates compromises. You usually have to make some compromises in order to actually deploy such a network. Such applications do not, for cost reasons maybe, or through other limitations in size or weight and so on, they cannot employ maybe full-fledged processors, operating systems, and so on. So you might not have full-fledged security solutions either implemented in these. So these resource constraints, they require security mechanisms. And we will learn in this lecture how we customize these security mechanisms, especially targeting IoT applications. So applications in which resources are limited, but we use them efficiently in order to employ as much security as possible to our devices. So the main question is, what could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot of things could go wrong. It's a field where you have billions of devices and they are connected to each other and to the internet with a lot of parameters, a lot of specifics, and they can be in some cases very easily the target of become very easily the target of an attack. And these attacks have happened in the past, and they are happening even as we speak. So we are talking today about a big zero-day flaw, for example, in Log4j. It's a logging library for Java. And it doesn't help that a lot of embedded devices and a lot of IoT solutions, they employ Java, and they employ this library to actually log their functionality. There are countless examples in media about different exploits, different hacks that have happened on IoT systems, be it smart locks, be it wearables and trackers, be it, I know, cars that have been remotely hacked and so on. So these situations, they're only bound to happen more and more if we don't employ the correct security measures in our systems, and if we just go with the de facto increase in IoT applications worldwide. So, for example, one very common type of attack is a distributed denial of system attack, in which you have what is called a botnet. So it's an IoT botnet. It's very similar to, let's say, a regular botnet over regular PCs, desktop or laptops. But instead of using PCs, it uses IoT devices that become infected with some sort of an exploit, and then they attack a given target. And given the fact that there are a lot more IoT devices in the world than actual PCs, then you can coordinate in hugely devastating denial of service attacks to a certain target. So you can flood a target with requests from billions of such devices in a very short time period. Why does IoT security matter? Well, no device is fully secured. You usually have reliance on third-party components. You usually have reliance on hardware and software that might not be entirely developed by you. So there's a dependency on networks, there's a dependency on external services, because IoT applications usually are complex. They involve some sort of communication between devices, a large number of distributed devices, some sort of computation which might be done on board or in the cloud. And there are vulnerabilities at each layer in this architecture and in the protocols that we employ to actually connect and deploy an IoT application. So security by design, unfortunately, for IoT has not been the norm. So the IoT sector has been developing over the past maybe 20 years or so. But given the fact that there were huge constraints even from the beginning, security was not the main concern of the IoT device manufacturers. IoT security, therefore, is currently very limited. There are investments on security and standardizing security for IoT systems, but these are very shy compared to their, let's say, similar investments in the security of regular PCs. There's kind of like an emphasis on functionality before having security in the system, which is, you know, it's good, it takes you to a certain level, but after a certain size of your IoT network, then it becomes very troublesome because there are real physical threats with risks to health and safety of millions or billions of users. So given the fact that IoT systems usually are implementing applications that might be critical, these have repercussions which are sometimes very, very dire to a lot of people. And there are no, right now, there's very little in terms of legal frameworks or liabilities for badly maintained IoT systems. So main challenges for IoT security, there's a very large attack surface because you have a widespread development. You have maybe a deployment of millions of such devices in the world. You know, just look at you know how many Amazon Alexas are out there right now. So there are probably tens of millions of Amazon Alexas in every home. There is a limited resource pool for every device. So there are not you know, hugely computation available. The availability of computation in these devices is not so good, and there's a lack of standards and regulations for how we implement security in such devices. There's also a lack of expertise at the end because they're so different from their PC homologs that you cannot employ standardized security methods that have been used for decades in the PC sector. So applying security updates, security patches is a thing in IoT systems, and these are quite regularly what make up most firmware updates to your local IoT device. So you have this cycle of bringing you know a startup to market, and you scale it as the business grows. And if you develop it in the IoT sector, then you might end up very quickly to manage billions of connected devices, which have your you know your solution running on them. Be it, I don't know, some sort of IoT solution which targets the consumer, maybe the health sector, or maybe the industrial or the residential sector. So you might end up very quickly in the terms of maybe half a year to a year to scale your business up to employ maybe millions of such devices or even billions of such connected devices all across the world. So when you're developing things this fast, security usually gets neglected. So, and there are multiple factors of why this happens, of course. You need to reduce your operational overhead. You need to factor in a lot of consideration into giving a very quick time to market for your products, which usually means that if you don't have very strong regulations around security, and things right now seem to be this way, you will neglect these matters. So there are three main aspects that we will discuss in the lecture today. One is security. So how an IoT creates an ecosystem of connected devices communicating over the networks, and how we employ security measures over such an ecosystem, such as we don't leave users exposed to various kind of attacks. We're going to talk about privacy. So the fact that an IoT application, even a small one, is quite sophisticated in terms of connectivity and in terms of reaching out to our everyday lives, means that there's a lot of personal data that is inherent to the application itself. So the applications usually collect a lot of personal data from the users without necessarily the user's active participation. So you might have a smart TV, for example, that monitors, let's say, your preferences in watching movies, and that's without your, let's say, consent, or without your active involvement into this. You just, just by scrolling some movie titles, it creates kind of a list of preferences for you. Or it can easily deduce, let's say, a smart assistant can easily deduce your shopping preferences by the things you order online from your Amazon Alexa or your Google Home and so on. So privacy is very important, and how we enforce privacy into these systems in order to protect the users, and compliance also. So like any other technology in the realm of business, it must comply with regulations. And even though this security aspect has been neglected, there are some regulations around security which are implemented and are standardized, and we need to track these during the lecture. So there are different aspects, of course, to how we actually connect to such a network. So, for example, there are aspects of authentication which are very similar to, let's say, a general means of authentication into a computing system. But it becomes even more stringent when we have millions of such IoT devices that are connecting to a network to create a trust relationship. And given the fact that you don't have necessarily control of your devices, they are deployed in maybe a hostile environment when they can easily be tampered with. You need to have a way to actually validate the identity of the device and the user through mechanisms which are quite, let's say, known to you: passports, tokens, biometrics, RFID, and so on. Authorization is a trust relationship that is established based on the previous step on authentication. And when you authorize a device, it determines that the information is safe to be accessed, and that device is usually secure. There is usually a network enforced policy that controls all the elements that route and transport endpoint traffic securely over the network through these established security protocols that we will talk about. And there's also an aspect of secure analytics. So having visibility and control to provide reconnaissance, threat detection, threat mitigation, all these elements that aggregate and correlate the information in your network. So going back to fundamentals, computer and network security is a collection of policies, mechanisms, and services that can enable a computer system or network to a certain level of required protection from unauthorized access or unintended cases. We have, let's say, a very simple, very intuitive security model It's called the CIA security model because it comes from confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is the three fundamental items in every secure system. Now, confidentiality usually means that there is a security mechanism in place which ensures that only the intended receiver can correctly interpret the message, and that an unauthorized access and usage is usually detected and prevented. So, for example, you ensure through confidentiality that sensitive information such as, I don't know, a person's information, maybe their biometrics, for example, they can, or credit card information, they are not obtained by any unauthorized party. Integrity, you have security mechanisms that must ensure that a message cannot be modified as it propagates from the sender to the receiver. So there is no unauthorized individuals that can destroy or even alter the contents of the message that is sent between two parties. And then you have at the end availability. The availability argument is that you have security mechanism in place that ensures that a system or network and its applications are able to perform their tasks at any time without any interruption. So availability is often a metric here. It's of course measured in percentages. So the percentage of time the system has been up in a certain time interval. So for example, in a month or in a year, or by measuring up or downtime for the system. So these are the fundamentals, and you can have some examples of confidentiality. For example, eavesdropping is the reception of a message by an unauthorized individual. You can have easily eavesdropping in networks which are communicating over a shared medium such as Wi-Fi, because you can have some third party that can sniff messages that are being sent in the network. That's an issue of confidentiality. So confidentiality is broken whenever you have somebody eavesdropping in this scheme. An issue of integrity might be a man-in-the-middle attack, which refers to a situation where an unauthorized individual or system, it positions itself between the sender and the receiver. The sender's messages usually are being intercepted, modified, and then retransmitted to the receiver. So this is between the sender and the receiver, you have a third party which actually processes the messages and tampers with them in such a way that the receiver will get the corrupted version of the messages, if any messages at all. Anyway, so it can easily disturb entirely the traffic of messages in the network. Finally, denial of service attack is a matter of availability. So denial of service refers to an adversary's attempt to usually disrupt the transmission of or services that are provided by the sender. So you have a way to jam the sender in order for the network to be flooded maybe with packets, or for other means in which you prevent the sender to actually deploy the messages in the network and prevent the messages from being sent to the receiver. So more terminology on the topic. You have authentication, of course, that refers to the process of establishing or confirming the identity of a user or a device. It's ensuring that a message actually comes from who it claims to have come from. So there's also a non-repudiation factor here. This usually refers to the process of proving that a person or device has performed a transaction or a transmission or a given transmission. And often you imply digital signatures in order to do this. They are also used to provide confidence that a message has not been altered. So for example, you can use digital signatures to guarantee that your messages have a high degree of integrity. Okay, in all types of communication networks, there are several fundamental security mechanisms that can be used to provide confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, for example, cryptography, and you're probably very familiar with cryptography from the lectures that you had before, is the process of hiding and protecting information using some sort of encoding and decoding scheme. So there are two main types of cryptography that are being employed into computing systems and computer networks. You're probably very familiar with them. It's symmetric cryptography, which means that you have a key that you use to encrypt your messages, and then the same key you use to decrypt your messages. And it can be a very simple shift cipher or Caesar cipher, as it's called. So you have a key which is a fixed shift in alphabet. For example, you shift the letter A by, I don't know, maybe 2 positions to the right. So A becomes C, C becomes E, and so on. So you encode the message by this. And as long as the receiver also knows that the messages that it receives have been shifted by a certain position, then it can do the reverse operation and recover the original message. There are, of course, more advanced symmetric cryptography protocols available today. Some of them are probably very familiar to you: DES, AES, IDEA, and so on. These usually employ coding and decoding scheme using this symmetric key. The problem with symmetric key cryptography is the fact that you need to have this key shared between the peers before the communication actually starts. I mean, you cannot send the symmetric key through the same network that you are using to communicate, because that can be easily intercepted by a third party and then used to decipher all network traffic. So you need to synchronize these keys previously, maybe at the installation, and then maybe you have a separate mean of actually updating those security keys. Now, you have another method of employing cryptography in networks, and that is public key cryptography. So this is a totally different approach in which you have other well-known algorithms such as RSA and Diffie-Hellman, for example. You have both a secret key and a public key. The secret key will never be communicated with any other device in the network, and the public key, on the other hand, can be shared freely with anyone in the network. So you eliminate this problem of sharing the symmetric key from symmetric key cryptography by having this pair of public and secret keys, public or private keys. You might find this in literature, and any message that is encrypted with the secret key or the private key can only be deciphered using the corresponding public key. So this can be used to authenticate the identity of the sender and to give a certain confidentiality aspect to the communication, through the fact that any message encrypted with the public key can be only deciphered using the corresponding secret key. So you can have this protocol actually provide you a high degree of confidentiality through this. Now, challenges of security in wireless sensor networks. Well, security has been a challenge in computing systems for decades. I think even since its inception, but even more for wireless sensor networks and IoT solutions, we have very stringent security challenges. Some of them are given by resource constraints, because you cannot employ traditional security mechanisms often in these solutions. You have mechanisms that are computationally expensive, but you have a limited computational bandwidth on your devices. For example, if your devices are 8-bit microcontrollers or even 32-bit microcontrollers or microprocessors, which have a limited amount of memory, networking bandwidth, storage capabilities, and so on, you cannot employ very computational, computationally intense tasks on them. There's also an aspect of energy constraints. Usually you have devices which are powered by batteries. So whenever you have a computationally intense task, this will mean that you will need to have extensive energy resources available, which are certainly not available in most IoT applications. There is a lack of central control, so it's often unfeasible to have a certain point of control in sensor networks. So because of their large scale, because of their resource constraints and network dynamics, the fact that the topology might change, you might not have a way to centralize your control of your system. So security solutions are often decentralized or distributed across multiple network nodes. There's also the aspect of the remote location of some of the applications that we use in IoT. So many devices are left unattended because they are placed in some remote area or hard to reach location. And it doesn't have to be in the middle of the woods. It can also be in I don't know, inside of a residential apartment building or a shopping mall and so on. So if you have maybe hundreds of thousands of these devices which are installed inside of a building, it can become very difficult to actually service all of them and maybe do some security upgrades to them. So coupled with that, you have error-prone communication. So it's especially when it comes to communication protocols of IoT devices, and we went through a few low-power protocols last week. What you can actually see is the fact that they can be easily jammed and they can be easily attacked through maybe a denial of service scheme. So employing communication in a shared bandwidth, most of them have the 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth as a reference. So Bluetooth, Zigbee, wireless HART, and so on, they use the same communication frequency band to transmit information. Well, it can become a very crowded environment and an environment which is easily targeted by attacks, or could be easily targeted by attacks. So security in these wireless sensor networks solutions or applications is, let's say, a stringent solution because you have some characteristics that facilitate security. On the other hand, so you have some pros also in IoT applications. So, for example, if you have a self-managing or self-repairing structure for your IoT application, then you can actually use that to your advantage. And the fact that you have multiple nodes, maybe hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of nodes, that means you have a high degree of redundancy in your system. So you can use, again, that redundancy to your advantage. So whenever you detect that part of your network is subject to an attack, you can disable that part of a network and reroute network traffic through other paths which are, let's say, clear of attackers. There's a problem of data freshness often in IoT systems. In that security must ensure that the sensor data that is gathered through the sensor network is recent. So you do not display or replay all data. And of course, this is particularly important when you have a security protocol that distributes security keys in your systems. So you have more opportunities in general for attacks than for other networks. You have location information that usually needs to be employed in the network because many sensor protocols actually use and require this location information. You have accurate synchronization or accurate means of deploying a certain action at a certain time for all devices in the network. And they can both be affected by modifying or injecting or dropping some messages carrying malicious information. So it's pros and cons here, and we're going to talk about the main vulnerabilities of IoT solutions, because there's a variety of attacks that attempt to compromise the network's operation. So first off, we're going to talk about denial of service attacks. So usually a denial of service attack can be characterized as an attempt of an adversary to stop a network from functioning or to disrupt the services of a network. In sensor networks, denial of service attacks, they can occur at various layers of the protocol stack. Some may affect multiple layers simultaneously or attempt to exploit interactions between them. So there's different flavors to denial of service attacks. The first of which is physical layer denial of service. So you have a jamming attack, for example, whenever an adversary interferes with the radio frequencies of a communication network. So if you have a well-positioned adversary, a few of these, let's say, attacking nodes, they can disable an entire network, even if the number of attacking nodes is much smaller than the number of nodes in the network. So it all comes down to how you deploy your network and how you position these nodes inside of a network. So even a single attacking node can easily disable if it's the network if it's positioned to a critical node. So for example, if you position such an attacking node close to a gateway, which guides the traffic from the entire network towards, let's say, the internet, you can, by disabling the gateway, you can actually disable the entire network. So you can cut effectively the transmission pathway between the network and the users which connect to the internet. A common technique against jamming in these transmission protocols is to use a spread spectrum communication scheme. And we've talked about spread spectrum communication last week when we discussed about Bluetooth, when we discussed about IEEE 802.15.4. So you have a frequency hopping spread spectrum scheme, or FHSS, that enables devices to communicate frequently in hops of frequencies according to a certain scheme. And the jammer can maybe jam one communication channel, one of such communication frequencies, but it's very hard for a jammer to predict the hopping scheme that is employed by the network, and as such to actually come and obturate all frequencies that are used in communication. So nodes can also be detecting a jamming attack and could issue a brief alert to their neighbors. And if neighbors are inside this region of attack, they can switch to a different frequency hopping scheme in order to prevent the attack. There's also a tampering attack scheme in which an adversary obtains physical access to the sensor node. So you can hack a sensor node, you can alter its programming, and in doing so, you can insert malicious packets into the network. So you can basically compromise the node that you have gained access to. So you can get access, for example, to your cryptographic keys in the network and use the device as an entry point for further attacks into the network. There are also strategies here to protect from device tampering. For example, we can use tamper-proof materials. You can use tamper-proof enclosures. There are even tamper-proof. There's even tamper-proof silicon and silicon chips that are available, so you cannot easily connect to them. You can secure the JTAG protocol that you use to actually program and update your firmware into these devices. So no hardware tamperer can actually insert malicious code into the device, so program the devices with a malicious code. A technique often used in system handling sensitive information, so for example, credit card payment terminals, is to erase all data whenever, let's say, a sensor within the device detects it's been tampered with. So, for example, you can have these card payments terminals which are enclosed in a light-proof case. So it's always dark inside. So whenever you open the case, you introduce light into the case, and you have a light sensor that detects this, so detects it's been tampered with, and then it erases all data on the device, on the credit card terminal, in order for it not to be exposed to a hacker. You have then link layer denial of service attacks. So this is we move up through the hierarchy, and we come to collision attacks, for example. This type of attack attempts to interfere with packet transmissions. So usually you cause costly exponential backup procedures, retransmissions in some MAC protocols, because you generate a lot of collisions within the network willingly, and then you cause these backup schemes that and retransmission schemes which can actually have a high cost on your network, especially when the network is powered through batteries that have a limited amount of energy. So you have a limited amount of messages you can actually send through these devices. There are some error correcting codes that can be used to recover from these schemes. So even if you receive a corrupted message, you can actually correct a certain number of bits in a packet, and you can recover even if you've been jammed through a collision attack. But this is limited, of course, to the number of bits that have been corrupted in a message. An attacker could also attempt to cause collisions near the end of a frame, which is causing a node to repeatedly transmit the entire packet again and again and again. And this is a different type of attack. It's called an exhaustion attack, in which the malicious entity has the goal of depleting the sensor's energy resources. So especially when we're talking about mobile nodes, if a sensor always has these messages corrupted, they will always try to send and resend and resend until their batteries are depleted. So, for example, you can have an issue of a continuous RTS message in IEEE 802.11 protocol, and then you prompt a CTS, a clear to send response, from another node. So if you continue to send request to send messages, so RTS messages, you will always receive clear to send messages from that node. And if you do that over a long time period, you will basically deplete the node's batteries by doing extensive handshaking. So there are also attacks on routing. An example of an attack on routing protocols of the sensor networks is the black hole attack. With this type of an attack, an adversary can attempt to be a forwarder of data for one or more routes in the network. So imagine you have a multi-hop network and data is routed through different paths in the network, and you have these attackers which actually pose as nodes in the network, and they can actually authenticate in the network and start forwarding messages. But instead of forwarding the messages, a malicious node can then simply drop all traffic that passes through it. So the traffic never reaches the destination. Another type of attack is a selective forwarding attack, where only packets that match certain criteria are dropped instead of dropping all packets indiscriminately. So you can actually camouflage yourself. You can very easily hide yourself in the network and drop just certain packages that target a certain maybe user or individual within the network. Rushing attack on a sensor network, it usually exploits the nature of the route discovery procedure on an on-demand routing protocol. So, for example, you can have in this type of an attack a malicious node that immediately forwards incoming route request messages to its neighbors. So, therefore, you rush these messages without consideration of any protocol rules. As a consequence, the node has an increased probability of being part of a chosen route between the source and the destination. So you rush your, let's say, position in the network when the network is establishing these connection routes, and therefore you gain a more important standing in the network through this type of an attack. Sinkhole attack is another variant of the black hole attack, in which, in order to attract as much traffic as possible, a malicious node attempts to position itself on the path of as many network flows as possible. So again, you try to gain, a very elevated position in the network in order to draw more traffic towards this sinkhole in the network. So you provide an attacker with the opportunity to disrupt or tamper with as much traffic as possible. Then there's the Sybil attack. It occurs when an attacker claims to have several identities in the network. So you can have, for example, location-based routing protocols in which an attacker claims to be at several locations simultaneously. So you can actually mask your position and issue conflicting location identities, and you can actually simulate you are in different geographical positions in the network. And many nodes believe that there is malicious code in their neighbors. There is a good chance that they will choose this node, so this Sybil attack node, as a forwarding node for their network traffic. So again, it's trying to attract network traffic to you by placing the compromised node in, let's say, high priority situation. You have a, let's say, higher standing than actual uncompromised nodes. And another attack routing procedure, lastly, is the wormhole attack. This attack is performed by nodes that have more resources available than typical sensor nodes in the network. So, for example, you have maybe two collaborating attackers that attempt to deceive the rest of the network by possessing an out-of-band or bandwidth-rich communication channel between themselves. So to the rest of the network, this appears as a very fast, high bandwidth link, which is desirable, of course, by many routing techniques. So the network automatically tends to route more and more traffic through that link. And with this approach, the attacker nodes can fake an efficient and short path to the gateway of a network. So therefore, you can attract a significant amount of traffic and enable a variety of other attacks, such as black hole or sinkhole attacks. So it's kind of a devious scheme to actually trick the network into sending more data to you. And routing attacks usually employ such a scheme. So all of these attacks here typically try to gain from advertising a certain compromised node as having more capabilities than usual. Moving up, attacks on the transport layer, and there are quite a few here as well, but mostly two of them are, let's say, more prevalent. Flooding attacks, these exploit the fact that many transport protocols, such as TCP, for example, they maintain a state information and they are vulnerable to memory exhaustion. So, for example, especially when you have devices which have a limited memory footprint, an attacker may repeatedly make new connection requests. So each new connection request will add more state information at the affected node. And given the fact that you don't have a lot of memory at the affected node, you can lead to the node refusing other connections in order to maybe keep keep its memory bound. And this in turn prevents the connection request from legitimate nodes from succeeding. So you flood the node with requests to connect from a compromised transmitter, and then the node will not connect to the network. In desynchronization attacks, so the second scheme here, you have an adversary which attempts to disrupt the communication between two legitimate nodes by repeatedly forging messages to these nodes. So, for example, you can, in transport layer protocols, use a sequence of numbers to keep track of successfully received packets. So you have a packet sequence number attached to every communication packet. So fake packets issued by an adversary can use this sequence number to make a node believe that its packets have not arrived at the destination. So therefore, the node believes that the packets have been lost, and then the node will try to retransmit those packets. So again, retransmission in IoT solutions usually is a costly affair. So you actually need to have a lot of energy available at your disposal to have retransmissions. So moving on, we have attacks on data aggregation. So data aggregation and data fusion are often used to combine multiple sensor data in order to eliminate redundant information. So you usually aggregate data and have beneficial effects from doing this on the resource requirements of sensor flows, for example. You reduce the frequency of transmissions or the packet sizes. So even a simple aggregation scheme can easily be influenced by an attacker, such that a network's behavior can be altered. So for example, if you employ very simple functions such as average, for example, averaging a function is just averaging multiple sensor values, and just by replacing a single measurement with a fake reading. So let's say you have the real measurement is x1, and then you have this x1 star fake reading, the average will change basically. So you can tamper with the values that are being sent by the nodes. So the trick is the attacker can choose this value and thereby determine the outcome of the aggregation. So you can easily determine how the aggregation will behave if you actually choose this value here. Similarly, the sum, the minimum, the maximum functions are also very insecure. So for example, the sum can be modified by maliciously replacing a real measurement with a fake reading. Again, just the same with minimum, with maximum, and of course with the count function. So if you count, for example, readings from a sensor, each sensor contributes to the result. Just by changing the number of readings, you change the result by at most, I don't know, k in this situation. So data aggregation schemes usually need to be employed over also encrypted communication channel. So you cannot have data aggregation schemes which are done in plain text or in in easily, because you can have eavesdropping, and then you can have attackers insert values to actually tamper with your measurements. Then you have privacy attacks. Usually these are attempts to obtain sensitive information that is collected and communicated in sensor networks and in IoT solutions. That is, an adversary may attempt to obtain sensitive information just by accessing the information that is stored on the sensor node, or by just eavesdropping on the network itself. So the fact that you have a communication environment that is shared by all devices makes it very easy for an attacker to monitor and to capture the transmissions between the nodes, particularly when there's no cryptographic mechanism employed. So you can just sniff the messages in the network And by sniffing the messages, you can determine very sensitive data that is being transacted. So eavesdropping can also be combined with traffic analysis, which can be used by an adversary to identify sensor nodes of interest in a network. So for example, increases in communication between certain nodes in the network can indicate an increased level of activity, and therefore the presence of data that could be compromised in these parts of the network. So similarly, traffic analysis can be used to identify nodes that may be more important to network operation than others, such as, for example, base stations or gateways. So if you don't have physical access maybe to the network and you just eavesdrop on the communication, just by eavesdropping on which entity is actually issuing more packets in the network, so which sensor node at which address is forwarding more information, you can actually infer from that if that particular node, for example, is a router or a gateway, and you can attack preferentially that device. Now, coming back to cryptography, in order to defend against many possible attacks, a variety of security protocols and other defense mechanisms can be used. So we need to talk about these in the coming slides and present a variety of protocols and mechanisms with a focus on their applicability in sensor networks. So we have these two approaches of public key cryptography and symmetric key cryptography, which have their own particularities. While public key cryptography can be used to provide confidentiality, integrity, and authentication, so CIA, public key algorithms are computationally expensive. So unfortunately, this limits their use in resource-constrained sensor networks. So whenever you have a network that is highly resource constrained, then you might not prefer these public key algorithms and instead prefer a symmetric key cryptography approach. It's significantly more resource efficient. It employs schemes that are, let's say, even less computationally intensive, and this makes them more common as a choice in IoT solutions. Even though there are implementations of RSA, for example, that are very widespread, even in very low power, very simple, such as 8-bit microcontrollers might have an RSA hardware acceleration available to them. A major disadvantage of symmetric key approaches is the problem of key distribution. So whenever you distribute the keys, you need to be very careful not to be tampered with. So the shared symmetric key must be first known to both communicating nodes before they can exchange data securely. So the receiver and transmitter, they both need to know this symmetric key. And of course, they cannot send it through the same communication channel they are sending the messages. Key management is another aspect, and usually symmetric cryptographic schemes are the common choice, as I said, when resource constraints prohibit the use of a more complex public key scheme. However, a shortcoming in symmetric cryptography is the need for key management. In order to mitigate this, there are a few schemes that can be used to actually securely distribute these symmetric keys. And one of these is peer intermediaries for key establishment, or PIKE. This approach is a technique that uses sensor nodes as trusted intermediaries for the distribution of keys. So in this approach, every sensor shares a different key with each of the other nodes. And usually when you have a network of, let's say, n nodes, there you have a complexity of O of square root of n. So what do I mean by this? The keys are deployed such that for any pair of nodes, let's say node A and node B, they constitute a pair, there exists at least one node, other node C, that shares a pairwise key with both A and B. So each sensor has an ID in the form of, let's say, XY, like this, where XY are in, the domain of the 0, 1, 2, 2, square root of n minus 1, where square root of n, where n actually is the number of nodes in the network itself. So that is, the sensor network is represented as a matrix of square root of n rows and columns. So basically, you have guaranteed that you have n devices in, that the matrix has n elements in it, and the node's position in the matrix is the node's ID. So each node shares a pairwise key with each other node in the following two sets. So these two sets here, I and Y and X and J, for example, they share a pairwise key. So for example, node XY will share a key. So for example, key might be this one, KXY1Y, with the node 1Y. And another key, XY2Y, with the node 2Y, and so on. So basically, on each node in this network will maintain 2 times square root of n minus 1 keys. So you have this figure, which shows a sample of virtual ID space for 100 nodes. So you have a matrix which is 10 by 10 here. So you have a total of 100 nodes in this virtual network, and each number represents the ID of a node. So for example, you have the ID 0 here, ID 1, 2, 3, and so on for the first 10 nodes, then to, of course, 99. So you have 100 nodes in total in this 10 by 10 matrix. And the dark shaded boxes, they identify all the nodes that share a key with node, for example, 91. So node 91 shares keys with node 81, 71, 31, 11, and 01. Okay? While the light shaded boxes, they indicate all nodes that share a key with node, for example, 13 or 14. So 14, for example, shares the same key with nodes 10, 11, 12 to 19, but at the same time, 14 shares a key with nodes 04, 24, 34, and 94. So the intersection of a column and a line, basically, they denote the, let's say, the commonality between these nodes. So if a node A, for example, node 14 here, wants to perform a key establishment with another node, so for example, node 91, so between node 14 and node 91, there needs to be a key establishing scheme, then A can identify, so node 14 can identify the identities of potential intermediaries just by looking at the intersections of the shadowed boxes. So for example, node 94 might be a good intermediary for between 14 and 91, because node 94 shares the same key as node 91 and as node 14. Again, node 11 might be a good intermediary in this scheme because, again, it shares the same key with node 91 and node 14. So in this scheme, node 14 encrypts the new key to be shared with node 91 using the existing key shared with node 94, and then sends the encrypted key to node 94. Node 94 then decrypts the message. It encrypts it again with the key shared with node 91 and sends the new message to node 91. And node 91 decrypts the message, obtains the new key, and confirms the receipt on the new key by replying directly to node 14. So you have a two-hop communication scheme in which node 14 encrypts the communication to node 94. Node 94 decrypts it and encrypts it again to communicate to node 91. And node 91 receiving the shared key between it and node 14 will communicate directly to node 14. So you have established a secure communication channel now between two remote nodes, which have previously been unable to communicate privately by using these trusted intermediaries in the network. Okay. How do you defend against these distributed denial of services attacks? So unfortunately, these are quite common and require effective measures to avoid them and prevent them from spreading throughout the network. So, for example, whenever a jamming attack is detected or suspected, sensor network can attempt to isolate the affected region by routing traffic around the disabled parts of the network. Another technique is to limit the damage from jamming attacks by using spread spectrum techniques. So as we have previously discussed. At the link layer, collision and exhaustion attacks can be addressed by using error correcting codes, just like we talked about, and rate limiting schemes. These allow a device to ignore requests that could lead to premature energy depletion. So whenever a node sees that it receives multiple requests to send messages, for example, from a peer, it can choose to actually neglect these messages after a number of retransmissions. So for example, if it receives, I don't know, 10 RTS messages, one after another, the 11th will be the others afterwards will be ignored. For spoofing and alteration, this can be addressed at the network layer by using message authentication codes. These message authentication codes are also shorthanded as MACs, but this is not medium access control. Message authentication codes can be viewed as cryptographically secured checksums of messages. So these checksums can allow a receiver to verify whether a message has been spoofed or altered. You can have something like a cryptographical CRC to actually prevent you from sending a tampered message. Path-based denial of service attacks, or PDoS, is an attack in which the attacker overwhelms the nodes in a remote sensor network by flooding the communication path with either, I don't know, random replayed packets or packets that are randomly injected in the network. You can try to avoid such denial of service attacks by having one-way hash chains. These are sequences of numbers where it is trivial to compute, let's say, and revalidate. So you can compute a kind of like a function, but it's very computationally infeasible to compute the inverse of this function. So each node in the network utilizes the hash chain to validate the received packet. So a node systematically cycles through the chain to determine whenever a packet is received, whether it's from a trusted source or not. So if a packet cannot be validated through this hash chain scheme, then it is dropped. So you can drop denial of services attacks by employing such a scheme. You can defend yourself, of course, against aggregation attacks that we've talked about in a previous slide. Many simple aggregation functions, such as a sum, a minimum, or a maximum, are inherently insecure. However, there are techniques for improving the resilience and of these aggregation functions. So, for example, you can have delayed aggregation or delayed authentication. In these techniques, it is assumed that the base station generates a one-way key chain using a public one-way function. So whenever you have this public one-way function, you have this functionality where the next key basically is computed as a function of the previous key. So each device stores the first key 0 or K0 before the deployment, and K0 might be mathematically expressed through this. So it's the nth power of a function of a key. So it's, for example, f applied to a secret key n times. Then the first base station transmission will be encrypted using K1, which is f to the power of n minus 1 of k. Once all messages transmitting using K1 have been received, the base station reveals K1, and as a consequence, all nodes can compute a function of K1 as being a function of the previous repeated key n minus 1 times, and verify that it matches this K0. Further, the sensor nodes can then decrypt the messages, and these messages you can imply that they have been transmitted with K0. So in a similar manner, successive keys can be revealed using this scheme until Kn equals K. So you can have a limited amount of aggregation and network traffic in the network given by these keys. So you have an example here. You have 4 nodes, and let's go to maybe this scheme here because it shows better what I'm talking about. You have these 4 nodes A to D, so A, B, C, D, and they are sending messages to the base station in a network structured as a tree. So you have this tree-like structure here, and the messages need to travel from A, B, C, D through the network to this base station S here. Each node's message contains the sender ID. So it has an ID for node A, an ID for node B, and so on. The sensor data, a MAC calculated over the data using this temporary key. So you have the ID, you have the data, RA, for example, and you have the MAC using this particular key for node A. You have the MAC here for node B, and so on. The parent node of the sensor node, so for example E in this case or F in this case, is not yet able to verify the MAC since the child's key has not been revealed to the parent. The parent node stores this message and retransmits it to its own parent after a certain timeout value. So after a certain timeout has expired, node E will forward the message from node A or from node B, but it aggregates these messages in such a fashion that E's messages, for example, to its parent G, contains the messages received from its children, so A and B, and the MAC computed over the aggregate of A and B's data using E's key now. So the message is increased through further computation of this key. And this process continues iteratively until the base station is reached. So for example, node G here will do the same thing when forwarding to node H. Once the base station receives the messages from its children, it can compute the final aggregate value. So you can actually compute this here. The base station has a shared temporary key with each sensor node. So therefore, it's the only entity in the system that can verify whether a received message has been transmitted by, let's say, node H, for example, by calculating the MAC of the aggregation of the messages and comparing it to the MAC in the message. While this validates that H sent the final message, it does not validate that the message correctly reflects the reading from the other nodes. So to validate this data, the base station reveals a temporary node key to the network by sending each key to all sensor nodes using its own current key. After sending out all the node keys, the base station sends out its current key, which has this key, such as the nodes are able to check the transmitted MAC values and to advance to the next key in the chain for future messages. So in summary, the process delays both aggregation and authentication. So for example, the aggregation does not take place at the first hop. the aggregation takes place in the network through multiple hops. While we increase the resource expenditures in such a way, it may be also we may also be able to enable integrity guarantees while consecutive nodes have not been compromised in a network. Now, how do we defend against routing attacks? Most attacks are from the outside of a network and can be prevented using a simple link layer encryption and authentication scheme. So you have a globally shared key, and whenever you have a new node joining the network, it needs to have these credentials. Because the adversary is prevented from joining the network, attacks such as selective forwarding or sinkholes, for example, are eliminated through this scheme. However, when networks are attacked from the inside, so for example, using a compromised node, this approach is very ineffective and more sophisticated solutions are required. Symbol attacks that we've discussed in a previous slide can be addressed by verifying the identities of certain sensor nodes. So for example, each sensor node could share a unique symmetric key with a trusted base station, which can be used to verify each other's identity. And the base station can also limit the number of neighbors a node is allowed to have. That is, even when a node is compromised, it can only communicate with its verified neighbors in this scheme. Sinkholes are difficult to defend against in protocols where routes are established on the basis of information that is hard to verify. So, for example, reliability of energy measurements. Routes that are based on minimum hop counts are easier to verify, but the hop count can be misrepresented through a wormhole. So one category of protocols that is resistant to these attacks is geographic routing, because networks using location-based routing techniques, they establish a topology on demand based on localization, interaction, and information without the initiation from a base station. So since traffic is naturally routed toward the physical location of the base station, it is difficult to redirect traffic elsewhere to create a sinkhole here. Okay, and then you have rushing attacks that we've discussed in a previous slide. In rushing attacks, the node's goal is to exploit the route discovery process in on-demand routing protocols and to position itself on as many routes as possible. So to prevent such an attack, a combination of several protective measures can be actually employed. So for example, some attackers may forward route requests beyond the normal radio transmission range. So for example, you can use high transmission power in order to forward these messages to nodes that are beyond, let's say, their normal horizon of communication. Thereby, you suppress the subsequent messages from this route discovery. There's also a secure neighbor detection approach that can be used to allow both the sender and the receiver of a route request to verify that the other party is in fact within the normal transmission range. So for example, a 3-round mutual authentication protocol with tight delay timing can be deployed in order to establish this. In the first round, you have a node that sends a neighbor solicitation packet. In the second round, you have a node receiving the solicitation packet and responds with a neighbor reply message. And in the third round, the initiator of this handshake will send a neighbor verification message again, which includes broadcast authentication of a timestamp and the link from the source to the destination. So basically you have a handshaking protocol here that establishes trust between these two nodes. Okay. Then moving on, let's talk about security protocols for sensor networks, or SPINs in short. This makes two main contributions to defending against attacks. You have a secure network encryption protocol, or SNAP, so it's called, and the micro version of the time-efficient streaming loss-tolerant authentication protocol, which is called micro Tesla. It's, so these two protocols have the goal of providing confidentiality, two-party data authentication, data freshness, and each node is assumed to have a secret key shared with the base station. Just moving, really quickly through these slides about these protocols. What you need to actually take into consideration is the fact that you have this secure network encryption protocol here, which uses symmetric security. So same message is encrypted differently each time, and you have mechanisms for replay protection and low communication overhead employed in the network. Usually it uses MAC for two-party authentication and integrity. So you have this integrity scheme in which you have, let's say, two nodes, A and B, that share a secret master key. And this master key is used to derive 4 independent keys for the communication using a pseudo-random function. This is the way of actually deploying such a communication scheme. I won't go into certain details. You can definitely look it up and see how it works. And this micro Tesla, it's a protocol that focuses on the need for authentication broadcast in wireless sensor networks. You rely on the symmetric mechanisms provided by Snap to authenticate the first packet in a broadcast message. So, for example, you can emulate this asymmetric communication through a delayed disclosure of symmetric keys. You have a communication method in which through an extension of this protocol, you focus on the need for authenticated broadcast in sensor networks. Now, Tinysec is a lightweight and generic link layer security package that developers can easily integrate into sensor network applications. So you can actually download this this security package code, and you can actually plug it into your own sensor network application. It's written in C, and it supports 2 different security options. You have authenticated encryption, so Tinysec AE, where data payload is encrypted and the MAC is used to authenticate the packet, and authentication only, so Tinysec Auth, this one, where an entire packet is authenticated with a MAC, but the payload is left unencrypted. Tinysec relies on Cipher block chaining, which is a scheme you have a specially formatted 8-byte initiation vector for encryption. So for authentication, Tinysec relies on efficient and fast Cipher block chaining constructions for computing and verifying MACs. So an advantage of this scheme is that since it relies on a block cipher, it minimizes the number of cryptographic primitives that must be implemented here. So it's beneficial for sensor nodes with limited storage capabilities. The length of the MAC itself is chosen to be only 4 bytes. That is, if the adversary can repeatedly attempt to blind forgeries, it would lead to success after 2 to the power of 32 blind forgeries. So this number might appear small, but you, as an adversary, you must assess the validity of a code by sending it to an authorized receiver. So this means that 2 to the power of 32 messages must be transmitted, which provides a sufficient level of security for sensor networks. Then you have LEAP, Localized Encryption and Authentication Protocol. Is a key management protocol for sensor networks designed to support in-network processing. Key motivation for this protocol is the observation that different types of messages, for example, control packets, data packets, and so on, in a network have different security requirements. So a simple single keyring mechanism may not be suitable for meeting these different requirements. And while authentication may be needed for all types of packets, confidentiality may be only required for certain types of messages. So, for example, you can have aggregated sensor readings which require a high degree of confidentiality. Leap provides 4 keying mechanisms here: individual keys, group keys, cluster keys, and pairwise shared keys. In the individual key mechanism, every node has its own unique key shared with the base station. So this key is used for confidential communication or for computing message authentication codes if a node wants the base station to verify its sensed readings. A group key is a globally shared key that is used by the base station for transmission of such encrypted messages to the entire sensor network. Common examples of such messages, they include queries, for example, interests, and so on. A cluster key is a key shared between a sensor node and its neighbors and is used for securing local broadcast messages. So, for example, routing protocol and routing control messages. Finally, this pairwise shared key is a key shared by a sensor node and one of its immediate neighbors. Leap uses these keys for secure communication among a pair of nodes. So, for example, allowing a node to securely distribute its cluster key to its neighbors or to securely transmit its sensor readings to an aggregation node. Okay, Leap also provides a technique for local broadcast authentication in which every node generates a one-way key chain of certain length and transmits the first key in the chain to each neighbor. This key is encrypted with a pairwise shared key. So whenever a node sends a message, it takes the next key from the chain and attaches it to the message. These keys are disclosed in the reverse order of their generation, and the receiver can verify the message based on the first received key of a recently disclosed authentication key. Okay, now coming back to the protocols that we've, some of the protocols actually that we've talked about in our previous lecture, IEEE 802.15.4 and Zigbee. Let's see what security methods they employ. So for example, IEEE 802.15.4 as a standard is very popular and provides 4 basic security models: access control, message integrity, message confidentiality, and replay protection. Security in 802.15.4 is handled by the MAC layer, and an application can choose specific security requirements just by setting appropriate parameters in the radio stack. So by default, for example, security is not enabled in 802.15.4. You need to set it on. So the standard distinguishes between 8 security suites, each with different levels of protection for the transmitted data. These are captured in this table, basically. So these are the eight security suites. The first one, so AES CTR, offers encryption only. So it's well, the first one is no security at all, but let's say the second one is encryption only. Followed by a group of suites with authentication only. So AES CBC MAC, for example, 128-bit, 64-bit, and 32-bit. These are only for authentication. And then a group for both authentication and encryption. So AES CCM on 128, 64, and 32 bits, respectively. SUS that offer authentication differ in the sizes of the MAC. This varies from 32 to 128 bits. So for every suite that offers encryption, IEEE 802.15.4 also offers optional replay protection, which consists of monotonically increasing sequence numbers for messages to allow a recipient to detect replay attacks.
Zigbee security, on the other hand, differentiates, actually introduces the concepts of a trust center. This is particular to Zigbee. Zigbee can mostly be built on top of 802.15.4. So this trust center is a responsibility which is typically assumed by the Zigbee coordinator in the network. So the trust center is responsible for authentication of devices that wish to join the network. You have something like a trust manager that actually does this. The trust center is responsible for maintaining and distributing the keys. So you have the network manager to do this, and enabling end-to-end security between devices. And then you have the configuration manager that handles this. Zigbee also differentiates between a residential and a commercial mode. So in residential mode, the trust center allows nodes to join the network, but it does not establish keys with the network devices. In the commercial mode, it generates and maintains keys and freshness counters with every device in the network. The disadvantage of the commercial mode is its memory cost, of course. So whenever you have these counters, you have to initialize them, you have to manage them, and the memory costs only grow with the size of the network. So Zigbee also uses the CCM mode. It's a special mode for its security services, which is also a combination of CTR and CBC MAC modes. Compared to CCM simple, CCM star mode offer encryptions only and integrity only capabilities. So it's similar to the specifications of 802.15.4, but it has several layers of security added that provide, let's say, a more compelling argument for security in Zigbee networks. So this basically concludes the discussion for today. Most of the information in these slides can be found in this book. It's got a very well-established section on wireless sensor network security, and most of the information that we've touched on today is from this. Now, any questions regarding what we've talked about today? Okay, if not, thank you very much.